Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Now, we woke up to some pretty concerning news this morning that a bridge in Baltimore, Maryland was taken down by a collision with a ship. It seems like a large ship has actually crashed into a section of the bridge, a very crucial section as it would happen, and brought the bridge partially down. Now, this isn't the kind of video that we normally make on this channel. This isn't a news or current events channel, but every now and then when something happens in the world of maritime safety, people will naturally want to know what we make of it, because the channel focuses here on the history of ships, the way they're built, the way they're operated, and their safety. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at the area where this has happened in Maryland, we'll take a look at the bridge itself, and then we'll kind of look at the ship and how this could have happened, because the footage that's been released of this event is, for want of a better term, pretty remarkable. Very dramatic stuff, and this is an ongoing catastrophe, and it seems like it's being described as a mass casualty event. So clearly, terrible news, terrible thing that's happened. So, where has this happened? Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore sits here on the US East Coast. This is a pretty important place. It's a real center of industry and commerce. The ports of Baltimore are fairly comprehensive and very big. And if we zoom in, you can see here that the city is up here towards the northwest, and there's a number of docking facilities and ports for ships. So a very comprehensive network of private boats, private yachts, and things like that. But further down here, you get a large terminal and a very big cargo loading and unloading area. Multiple docks, multiple shipping companies will be coming in here, taking in some pretty serious commerce and taking it out in very large volumes. And right at the entrance to the channel leading up to the major port here, you can see the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Now, this is the bridge in question that's actually been involved in the incident. But just looking at this entrance here, you can see that it's a pretty tricky one probably to navigate for ships as they're coming in from the East Coast. If you were to enter from the North Atlantic Ocean, you would be probably sailing in straight through here. It's a pretty wide channel entrance there, 10 miles, 17 kilometers, and then it's a fair way up north through Chesapeake Bay to get to the entrance of the mouth of the river here to get into the port of Baltimore. Now, obviously there'd be a lot of maritime traffic coming in and out of this area, but critically, the distances here are not great. So the distance between these 2 points entering the port here, it's pretty tight. 1.8 miles, 2.8 kilometers. So obviously navigation in this area is of the utmost importance, because one wrong move and a ship the size of the one that we've seen involved in this collision will do some very serious damage. It just so happens in the last couple of weeks we've been doing videos on how do big ships stop, in the event of a disaster. How do they react to this kind of situation? So seeing it play out in real life is a really weird thing. So sitting across the entrance to the port here is the Francis Scott Key Bridge. The bridge has a pretty significant span. So it actually dates the 1970s, the late 1970s. It's a steel truss bridge, and truss bridges are designed to be as lightly built as possible while offering the most strength, the most flexibility. So a pretty strong bridge, a very long bridge. So it's actually here just over 1 kilometer wide, just about 1 mile wide. And if we put our little guy down here on Street View, we get a good view of the bridge spanning the river here. And you can see that there are a number of large kind of support pylons that will be taking the brunt of this weight. Quite a lot of traffic, because it does run up to the northeast and connects to sort of halves of the city here, connecting this side of the city, the southeastern side of town, with the rest of the state, heading towards Washington. So obviously a pretty busy area. But although having a bridge that's about 1 kilometer wide is impressive, about 1 mile wide, that's a pretty big bridge. That's not a big area for a ship to navigate. Here we get a great sort of bird's eye view of the bridge, and you can see that it rises up quite significantly in the middle here, where you get the maximum height, so that large ships can safely go underneath. But you can see that it's not a very big gap. Big ships will only be able to pass through this center span, not any of these. This is obviously too small. They would probably be able to get through from about here, where these sailing boats are, here down, but they'd be aiming right through the middle of the channel to get under that center span. You can see it's not very wide. It looks big and impressive, and it is, but when you imagine that this is about 1 kilometer wide, and the big cargo ship laid out on its side across here would take up about 1/3 of the distance. So safe navigation through here, absolutely of the utmost importance. You can see over here the dock facilities, that kind of large loading and unloading terminal that we were talking about. So, what about the ship that has actually been involved in the collision with the bridge? Her name is the MV Dali. She's a container ship. She's pretty decent size, about 300 meters long, which is a fairly significant length, 48 meters across. I'll add the conversions in feet on the video here. She's flagged to Singapore, and she's just shy of 100,000 gross tons. The dead weight, summer tonnage, is about 116,000 tons. So this is a pretty significant cargo ship, a very large vessel. For those at home, that's around about the size of 2 Titanics. So it's a lot of ship. So if we look on port and follow the track, we can see that the ship has departed from the terminal here at Point Breeze, and she's outbound for Chesapeake Bay and probably heading out to the North Atlantic. She's probably loaded up with a ton of cargo from the terminal and has come out into the river to execute a turn to enter the main channel and head straight down the barrel for the bridge. Now, we were talking earlier that the navigation through this point is obviously extremely important. The Chesapeake Bay and the surrounding area is quite shallow and very dangerous. So the pilot would have been on board the ship, and he will be kind of directing them through this area. The pilot who's actually familiar with the area and knows it like the back of his hand. I would imagine they would probably have a pilot on board, I assume, as far as the entrance to the ocean here, just out past Virginia Beach, because again, it's quite tight, very shallow, very narrow waterways. You've got another narrows here at Kent Island, with Annapolis over here in the west. So it's a pretty tricky waterway to navigate. At 5:05 UTC on the 26th, so they've finished loading and they have departed. And they have executed the turn to get into the middle of the channel. About 15 minutes later, they are right in the middle of the channel approaching the bridge. And it's unclear how accurate this data is, but we can see that the wind, 6.2 knots, not particularly severe. The ship's speed is 7.9 knots. So in tight waterways like this, ship speeds are usually limited between about 5 and 8 knots thereabouts to prevent wash and specifically to make sure that events like this are less likely to happen. But something's gone wrong. About here, 5 minutes later, 5:25, the ship has altered course slightly. There's not been any gusts in wind. She's doing just in excess of 8 knots. And she's altered her course slightly to starboard. So she's heading out towards the bridge. At this point, the ship would have been about here, heading towards the bridge. And she's headed over to the right-hand side of the channel. Now, in the footage, you can see a little bit of what has happened and maybe get a bit of an idea on what could have gone wrong here. You can see that as she's approaching the bridge, her lights actually snap out twice. The ship's power is lost, and then she begins that change of course, heading straight for the supporting pylon. There's a huge belch of smoke out of the engines, and she turns straight for the pier that's essentially supporting the span of the bridge, and that's what she impacts. So if we look at our bird's eye view of the bridge, you can see this is the supporting pylon, the pier that she's actually impacted. That's just about the worst thing the ship could have hit, because it's holding up an immense amount of weight, and it's brought down the rest of the bridge around it. So what's actually happened here? Well, the clues are kind of there in the lights snapping out. It's extremely unusual. That just should not be happening. It indicates potentially some kind of power outage on board the ship, would make actually maneuvering the ship extremely difficult. If communication between the ship's helm and engines and the rudder and the engine room are lost, then the ship is essentially out of control. Most importantly, though, the ship is doing a fairly significant clip. Here she's doing about 8.8 knots, which is, when you think the fact that the ship's about 100,000 tons large, that's just a lot of momentum. In the video that we did just last week about how big ships stop, we talked about this kind of exact scenario where a big ship like this has a number of ways of coming to a crash halt. The first, the most obvious one, is to throw the engines in full reverse. Now, a ship like the Dali is a massive diesel-powered ship. It'll have diesel engines down in our engine room and one propeller. And it's a very efficient setup, but it's not particularly responsive, especially with that much dead weight moving at that speed. It takes a lot of time, even with your engines in full astern, full reverse, to actually bring your ship to a stop. And with that much momentum behind them, the stopping of a ship can take about a mile or more. It can take a very significant amount of time to bring the ship to a complete stop. The other way that ships can bring themselves to a stop is actually to initiate a turn. So by turning and slowly powering the engines down instead of throwing them in full reverse, a big ship can actually bleed off a fairly significant amount of speed. They can lose between 40 and 70% of their speed just in a sharp turn. What's interesting about this bit of footage is the ship clearly begins a turn to starboard as she's approaching the bridge, with smoke pouring out of her funnel. It almost seems to me as if they were experiencing issues with their power, potentially their navigation, and that the crew have possibly attempted to bring their ship to a sudden stop, altering the state of their engines, potentially by throwing them in reverse, putting them astern, which could account for that sudden belch of smoke that we see from down in the engine room. Typically, another maneuver that ships like this can use is to suddenly deploy their anchors at either side of the ship, which are usually kept on standby during departure and arrivals for a sudden crash stop, or to try to actually hitch the anchor and use its really heavy chain as kind of like a sea brake to suddenly pivot the ship around. And it does almost seem like she might have dropped one of her anchors, potentially her port anchor here, in an attempt to cancel out this turn, which might indicate that it maybe wasn't a intentional turn, that they were maybe trying to desperately bring the ship's bow back towards the center span of the bridge. What happened on board the ship we are likely not to know for a little time yet. But what is really surprising to me is the fact that there weren't tugs alongside the ship. Tugboats are extremely versatile, extremely strong vessels that can support big ships on the way in and out of ports. And usually tugs are brought alongside ships until they've cleared the most dangerous part of a waterway, specifically for this reason. Now, different ports have got different regulations around when tugs are required. It's really surprising to me that you've got a bridge span that wide, just over a mile wide, which is, as far as ships go, a little narrow, because there's only a little window in the middle where the ship could be able to get through. Having a tug alongside to bring the ship to a sudden stop, or to push the ship's bow out of harm's way, is critical. I mean, that's what they're designed to do. I was actually invited out on a tugboat by a viewer of the channel just a couple of weeks ago. He's a tugboat captain in Melbourne, my hometown. He invited me out, and he told me some interesting things about the way that tugs actually operate. They are very, very powerful machines. They have essentially like thrusters hanging underneath the tugboat. They can spin on a dime. They can do a full 360-degree spin, no problem. And the way that they actually bring big ships to a halt is they'll have these big lines attached to ships like this. And the tugboats will actually swivel their thrusters to point outwards away from one another, which sounds counterintuitive, but by blasting the throttle out to the side, the jet of water creates so much drag, kind of like the wings of a butterfly suddenly being turned sideways, that it will just bring the ship to a stop. Of course, being connected to a 100,000-ton cargo ship, it can take a little bit of time. And so typically ships like this will have 2 or 3 tugboats, one forward, one aft, and maybe one in reserve somewhere alongside to actually maneuver the ship. ships are very capable of doing their own maneuvering. They need steerage way, which is the amount of speed required to actually get water over the rudder to turn. That happens at around about 8 knots. So this ship had steerage way. She was able to turn herself. But what is really unusual is that there weren't any tugs with her to actually help her out in case of a situation like this. When Queen Mary 2 was being pulled out of Sydney Harbour just the other week when I was visiting, there were tugs alongside. Queen Mary 2's actually got very significant manoeuvring equipment down below, including bow thrusters, and then her own thrusters at the stern, her azipod thrusters, which can turn instead of a conventional rudder. And it means that the ship was perfectly capable of manoeuvring herself out of the dock. And in the video I took just the other week, you can see tugboats positioned fore and aft with tow lines attached, but they're slack because they're not really doing anything. Sydney Harbour is also a very shallow waterway. You see here that it kind of similarly to the entrance to Baltimore has got a number of narrows. So as Queen Mary 2 was coming out of this area, she's going to then enter kind of like the danger zone where between the Sydney Opera House here and the point on the other side, it's only about 1,500, 1,600 feet. So obviously turning and maneuvering, getting that dead right is extremely important. But the tugs would stay with the Queen Mary 2 very, very far until at least she'd cleared the heads here, Quarantine Head to the Hornby Lighthouse. It's about 1.5 kilometers, 5,000 feet. The reason being, were Queen Mary 2 or a similar ship to suffer a power failure or to suffer any kind of issue, the tug at the forward end of the ship would be able to either bump up against the ship and push its nose in a certain direction or pull it on the tow line in another direction. As with the tug at the stern, they'd be able to pump the brakes and bring the ship to a slow stop. They would be able to actually respond. And what's really interesting is the fact that in the footage, I can't see any tugs helping Dali navigate the channel here. It could be that tugs aren't required for cargo vessels entering and exiting the port, but I would be very surprised if that were the case after this event. If this disaster doesn't rewrite the rules for big ships coming into and out of Baltimore, it would at least make sense to have big tugs escorting them as far as the entrance here to the Baltimore port, beyond the bridge, out as far as this, because then the ships will have steerage way, they'd be able to make it down south and out of Chesapeake Bay. So it's a pretty horrendous event, and it's a little bit surprising that this has happened because, you know, we have the technology to essentially prevent things like this from happening, and it's a little bit strange to see a ship this big maneuvering her way out of a fairly tight space without any kind of support from tugs, anything to back her up. It's unusual there was nothing alongside to help prevent this kind of situation, because although it does seem to happen fairly quickly, I do wonder if tugs positioned at the forward end of the ship and the stern might have been able to at least swing the bow around, maybe get it pointing in the correct direction, or might have even been able to bring her to a slow stop. Unfortunately, it seems like in this instance, dropping the anchor, throwing the engines astern was just too little too late, given the huge amount of momentum behind the ship. If you're interested in the way that these kind of physics work on ships like this, go and check out the video that we did on how big ships stop, because it'll explain a lot of what's going on here. So there you go. I hope you found this interesting. Please let me know if you've got any questions in the comments, or if anything new has kind of popped up since we talked about this video. Naturally, this will be probably investigated by a number of authorities, but I'm sure the NTSB, the National Transport Safety Board of the US, will be heading up some kind of investigation. What will be really interesting is seeing what happened down in the engine room, why the ship executed that sudden turn to starboard, why the power went out the way it did. It's just not designed to happen. And ships have got a number of systems, like backup power systems and generators and things, to actually prevent that from happening. So clearly something has gone very wrong, but we'll keep an eye on what's going on. It's pretty horrible to see this kind of thing. Safety standards and protocols are written in blood, they say, and in this instance, it seems that there may be some alterations to the way that ships are guided into and out of the port of Baltimore, because, although the ship was underway, although she had steerage way, it is extremely counterintuitive, I think, to have a ship operating in such a narrow confine with no support vessel alongside to kind of nip her out of danger's way if it came to it. So here's hoping that there is only good news in the next few days over people being found safe and sound. But until then, until we find out more, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again.